Some people trust corporate leaders in the private sector but distrust the government. Some people trust political leaders in the government, but they distrust firms in the private sector. Economists say that everyone responds to incentives or the lack of them, and economists don't trust anyone. After all, we all know that sometimes business leaders are instrumental in creating companies that provide high-quality goods and services at a great price and great jobs for employees. And sometimes politicians really do look to the public interest with far-sighted legislation. But other times, business leaders run their companies into the ground while they personally get rich. And sometimes, political leaders may seek to extend their own term in office or raise their own salaries or respond to the loudest special interest group. These observations raise the issue of governance. How are organizations governed? What set of incentives are leaders of organizations responding to? The issues of political and corporate governance can be analyzed with the analytical structure of what economists call a principal-agent problem. In a political context, citizens are the principals and politicians are the agents who are, in theory at least, acting in the interest of the citizens. In a corporate context, the shareholders in the company are the principals and the top executives are the agents who are supposed to be acting on behalf of the shareholders. In general terms, in any principal-agent problem, one party, the principal, wants another party, the agent, to do something. The relationship between an employer and an employee is a common example of a principal-agent problem as well. What makes principal-agent problems interesting is they all typically involve imperfect information. The principal has a hard time knowing whether the agent is working hard or efficiently or acting in their best interest, or if they're really doing the best they could to produce the right kind of output and a high quality of output. Thus, a common problem for principal-agent problems in the employment context is how to set pay. For example, if all the output that someone makes is perfectly observable by both principal and agent, then you can just agree that you'll just pay for what's produced. But most of the time, output is not perfectly observable. Think of jobs like being one research scientist in a laboratory or one cash register operator in a McDonald's restaurant. What's your personal output? Was the output of high quality or not? What happens if certain circumstances let one worker produce a lot of output by blind luck, and maybe someone else worked just as hard, but they didn't produce as much just because of bad luck? How do you determine what rate of pay is appropriate for those different cases? Well, typically, you try and put together some sort of a pay package where the worker gets a certain amount, and the worker could get more if everything went really well. But there's some subjectivity about whether things have gone well that needs to be hammered out. Another problem arises for principal-agent problems in political governance and in corporate governance. In both cases, there's a lot of principals. There are either a lot of voters, who are the principals for the politicians, or a lot of shareholders, who are the principals for the corporate executives. And in that situation, the principals face a free rider problem, in the sense we talked about before. For any individual, their effort to monitor the agent is not likely to make a heck of a lot of difference. All the principals would prefer that someone else take the time and cost and energy of monitoring their agent, monitoring the politician, monitoring the corporate executive. As a result, the agent, the politician, or the corporate exec manager may end up not being monitored very much at all. Principal-agent problems are never perfectly solved. You just need to find ways to try and reduce the conflict between principal and agent to some sort of manageable level. Now, holding that sort of principal-agent concept in mind, let's now talk about issues of governance. We'll first talk about problems of corporate governance, where shareholders are trying to get corporate executives to act in their interest, and then we'll talk about political governance, where voters are trying to get politicians to look after their interests. Large firms have what economists call a separation of ownership and control. That is, a large firm is owned by a shareholder, but controlled by the top managers. So, In that situation, what or who is going to monitor and constrain the managers and force them to act? This problem has been around for a long time. It first came up, I think, in a classic 1932 book called The Modern Corporation and Private Property by two economists named Adolf Berle and Gardner Means. And they talked about this gap between ownership and control. When mega companies first came into real prominence in the U.S. economy in the late 19th century, they were often more or less run by individuals like Andrew Carnegie or John Rockefeller or J.P. Morgan. But the early decades of the 20th century began to see more and more companies which were publicly owned. By publicly owned, I mean they were owned by thousands or millions of somewhat anonymous shareholders. Now, how are those who owned the company in that way, those anonymous shareholders, to manage those who ran it day to day? How are the principals supposed to give incentives to the agents? In a way, if the principals lack power to control the agents lack any incentive to act in a way that will benefit the principals. Now let's sort of flash forward to the present. Perhaps the classic case in recent years is what happened at Enron. On December 31st, 2000, stock in Enron, a company that bought and sold natural gas and electricity among other goods, was selling for $83 a share. That stock price had risen 87% in 2000. It had risen 56% in 1999. It had risen 37% in 1998. It was on a roll. Enron was rated the most innovative large company in America by Fortune magazine's survey of the most admired companies for all of its internet-based markets and all these strategies with long-term contracts. But by December 2nd, 2001, less than 1 year later, Enron had filed for bankruptcy, and a bunch of legal investigations had been started into the accusations that some of the firm's financial records were highly misleading or even fraudulent. So how does a company go from being a role model, most admired in the country, to having its top executives threatened with jail in less than a year? What safeguards were supposed to be in place, but failed to happen? Well, executives at top companies are supposed to have a variety of parties watching them. One, of course, is the individual shareholders, but I argued a moment ago that most individual shareholders are very small scale. They really lack the power and really the incentive to spend a lot of time and energy trying to monitor top shareholders. Or top executives. So who is going to monitor those top executives? Well, shareholders elect a board of directors. And the board of directors are the ones who directly hire and fire the top executives. The problem is that often the top executives are the ones who decide who will be running for the available slots on the board of directors. So the top executives are hired and fired by the directors, who are elected by the shareholders, but often who's on the board of directors is handpicked by the top executives in the first place. So the independence of the board of directors can be questioned. Often there's this fear that there's kind of a case of among top executives from different companies of, well, you be on my board, I'll be on your board, wash my back, I'll wash your back. And while there have been more independent board members in recent years than there used to be, those interpersonal relationships can still be fairly cushy in a way that it's not clear who is monitoring who. It's also true that being a board member is a part-time job. It consists of a few big meetings a year, where information for those meetings and the agenda for those meetings is often provided by the top executives of the company in the first place. So an aggressive board of directors can provide some oversight, but there's limits on what it can do. It's not a second level of management. Publicly owned firms are also required to be audited and to report public financial statements. However, in recent years, it seems clear that some auditors have not been as aggressive in questioning financial arrangements as the shareholders might have liked. Auditors are a firm that's hired to go over the financial records of a company and certify that everything looks reasonable. But the auditor works for the firm, is paid by the firm, and can make suggestions about financial and business strategies to the firm. At the same time, it's supposed to be monitoring the firm. It's not clear exactly how this is supposed to work. Clearly, a number of accountants got what I think of as the tax lawyer mentality. Tax lawyers think up ways to beat the tax code. In fact, some people say tax lawyers are the only lawyers who really make their money by figuring out how to avoid the law. It seems to me that a lot of accountants got a view that they needed to deliver certain profit numbers, regardless of the underlying reality. The auditors for Enron were the Arthur Andersen Company. In 2000, Andersen earned $52 million in fees from Enron, which might have created a certain incentive not to risk offending top management at the company. Another possible monitor for top executives would be large outside investors, like those who invest in large mutual funds or pension funds. They have a really large ownership share or a larger ownership share. So unlike the person who owns 100 shares of stock, they actually have some incentive to watch the owners more carefully and to monitor them and spend time and energy in looking after them. But, in the Enron case, the large investors didn't seem to do much either. About 60% of total Enron stock was owned by large investors late in 2000. And if you look at October 2001, it was still true that about 60% of Enron stock was owned by these large investors, many months after it had become clear that something was deeply wrong with this firm. The large investors did not react quickly, and they didn't seem to monitor very aggressively. Who else could monitor the executives? Well, the sort of broad financial community, the stock market analysts who give advice to financial investors, the banks that make loans to firms, the journalists who write for the business press, they all have some power to monitor top executives. But with a very few exceptions, for example, Fortune magazine ran a prominent story in March 2001 questioning what was going on at Enron. None of these watchdogs really barked in the case of Enron. After all, the pay of stock market analysts, and to some extent their access to information, are determined by whether they are viewed as good team players. And the same is true of business journalists and bankers. You have to always ask these folks, how ready are you to be the skunk at the garden party? And remember, skunks don't get invited to many more garden parties. This was particularly a problem in the late 1990s, when the stock market and Enron stock is going way, way up. A serious act of group seduction went on at that time, and when it was all over, everyone sort of looked up and said something like, well, I thought you were supposed to be the sensible one. I thought you were doing the monitoring. And in fact, nobody really seemed to be. So these other methods of monitoring executives don't seem to be all that effective. Corporate takeovers and mergers could be another way for financial markets to discipline top management. In theory, a poorly run company that, say, is funneling a really large share of its money to top executives could be bought out and taken over by a better run company, and it does happen that way sometimes. In the 1980s, there was a lot of talk about how leveraged buyouts were used as a way of buying firms, companies that borrowed a lot of money and bought up a firm. And a hot new trend in corporate finance in the mid-2000s is the rise of what are called private equity firms that buy companies and run them or perhaps break them up or restructure them before selling them. So it's certainly possible that poorly run companies could be bought and reformed. But the reverse is also true. A poorly run company that's temporarily attracted a lot of money might also take over a smaller, well-run firm. And the well-run firm will say, hey, if you're going to give me that much money, I might as well take the offer. The overall record of corporate takeovers and mergers is that, on average, they're a good deal for the firm being bought, but they are an average deal at best for the firm which is actually doing the taking over. Stock options for top executives were touted as another way of getting top executives to act in the interests of their shareholders. The idea was that if top executives owned a lot of stock, then they would want to act in a way that would raise the stock price. And certainly, the growth of stock options meant that top executives had a lot more stock than they did before. If you look at the top few executives and the members of company boards, and the top 1,500 publicly traded companies in the U.S., the top executives and the boards owned, on average, about 13% of the total stock of those companies in 1985. But by 1995, they owned 21% of a comparable sample of companies. This business, though, of expanding the use of stock options was very costly. It succeeded in getting top executives to hold a lot of stock, but it also cost a lot, and it provided some incentives for imprudent management. For example, by one count, during 5 years from 1998 to 2002, the total pay to the top 5 executives at top 1,500 large firms totaled $100 billion just to those 7,500 people. Now, the incentives of stock options are also not altogether clear. You want to have good management. You don't just want to pay because the stock market is going up. You don't want to just have the executives do whatever will pump up the short-term stock price, possibly including something that might skate on the edge of fraud. So it's not clear that rewarding every increase in the stock price is exactly the right thing you're looking for in giving incentives to managers either. In 2002, sort of in the aftermath of the Enron disaster and some other companies, a law was passed called the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And it imposed a number of new rules on the institutions of corporate governance. New rules about how to choose boards of directors, about auditors, about stock market analysts, a new government accounting oversight board. It probably wasn't a bad idea to alter these rules, but maybe the big problem is that all of these rules need to be interpreted and enforced. And bottom line, we've got a principal agent problem here. It remains true that top executives of firms have strong incentives to report high profits and to take high salaries for themselves. There is still a separation of ownership and control. And many of the people who are supposed to be monitoring the top executives have strong incentives not to upset or anger the people who ultimately are supporting their career in one way or another. Given that basic reality, it remains uncertain whether Sarbanes-Oxley is really going to make a huge difference. As noted before, principal agent problems are never fully resolved. The best hope, I guess, is that we're in the course toward working out some new understandings for how shareholders will monitor the executives who, in theory, are working on their behalf. Let's now shift over to the problem of governance in government. Many of the people who are most skeptical of the inability to monitor and constrain top management actually think, well, let the government take over some of this stuff. Let the government set rules instead of having these top executives run wild and free. But you can't really monitor the government either. Many of the difficulties in the market identified in the preceding lectures, like monopoly and pollution and poverty and welfare and imperfect information, have all suggested a possible role for government to act in a way that might improve social welfare. But government is a complex organization of elected and appointed officials, and such organizations might not always be focused on the greatest good of the greatest number. Democratic governments are supposed to be, as President Abraham Lincoln famously said in the Gettysburg Address, of the people, by the people, and for the people. In the simple theory of democracy, voters choose and monitor elected officials. But in fact, many people don't vote at all. In recent U.S. presidential elections, only about half of voting-age citizens actually vote. In local elections, the turnout is typically even lower. Well, why don't people vote? In most elections of any size, the margin of victory is measured in hundreds or thousands or even millions of votes. A rational voter will recognize one vote is not likely to make a difference. In his 1957 work called An Economic Theory of Democracy, the economist Anthony Downs put the problem this way. He said, it seems probable that for a great many citizens in a democracy, rational behavior excludes any investment whatever in political information per se. No matter how significant a difference between parties is revealed to the rational citizen by free information, or how uncertain he is about which party to support, he realizes his vote has almost no chance of influencing the outcome. Or in his classic 1948 novel, Walden 2, the psychologist B.F. Skinner put the issue even more succinctly. One of the characters in the novel says, "The chance that one man's vote will decide the issue in a national election is less than the chance that he will be killed on his way to the polls." Rational people don't risk death in order to vote. Now, you can say, well, but what about all these close elections? I remember this state was close. In this election, it still wasn't one vote. One vote wasn't making the difference. How do we get people to vote more? Well, there are lots of proposals. Keep the polls open for more hours, move election day to a weekend when people don't have to worry about their jobs or their school commitments. And in general, we've been moving in that direction for a long time now, for decades, making it easier and easier to vote. And at the same time, the voting rate has been falling and falling and falling. Casting an informed vote is always going to impose some costs of time and energy. And it's just not clear that rational people in a fairly stable country are going to do that. So if the majority isn't always going to make its wishes felt, who will? What's going to happen in the political process? Well, special interest groups are groups that are numerically small but quite well organized. A focused special interest group could pressure legislators to enact public policies that benefit the group at the expense of the broader population. For example, imagine an environmental rule to reduce some kind of air pollution. And let's say that it will cost 10 large companies $8 million each to comply with this rule. So the total cost is $80 million. Let's say the social benefits from this rule would benefit each person in the United States by $10. So the benefits, $10 times a population of 280 million Americans, would be $2.8 trillion. Now, the benefits are far, far higher than the costs. But who's going to lobby for this law? The 10 companies that have to pay the $8 million are likely to lobby much more fiercely than the average person is to argue for $10 worth of benefits. Special interests don't just block things, like environmental legislation, they also get things passed that aren't such a good idea either. Special interests are often the ones who call for price controls or subsidies or tax breaks or shutting out competing imports or setting up regulations that especially favor them. When legislators are negotiating over whether to support a piece of legislation, a common request is for them to include pork barrel spending. Pork barrel spending is defined as legislation that benefits mainly a single political district. And pork barrel spending can be thought of as yet another case where democracy is challenged by the problem where benefits are concentrated and costs are widely dispersed. The benefits of pork barrel spending are obvious and direct to local voters. The costs are spread out over the country. For example, U.S. Senator Robert C. Byrd of West Virginia, who was originally elected to the Senate back in 1958 and was still serving into the 2000s, is regarded as one of the great modern masters of pork barrel politics. Here's a list of structures in West Virginia, at least partly funded by the government and named after Byrd. There is the Robert C. Byrd Highway, the Robert C. Byrd Locks and Dam, the Robert C. Byrd Institute, the Robert C. Byrd Lifelong Learning Center, the Robert C. Byrd Honors Scholarship Program, the Robert C. Byrd Green Bank Telescope, the Robert C. Byrd Institute for Advanced Flexible Manufacturing, the Robert C. Byrd Federal Courthouse, the Robert C. Byrd Health Sciences Center, the Robert C. Byrd Academic and Technology Center, the Robert C. Byrd United Technical Center, the Robert C. Byrd Federal Building, the Robert C. Byrd Drive, the Robert C. Byrd Hilltop Office Complex, the Robert C. Byrd Library, the Robert C. Byrd Learning Resource Center, the Robert C. Byrd Rural Health Center. Now, maybe every single one of those is completely well justified, but at least some of them smell like pork. Pork barrel spending can also be encouraged by what's called log rolling on the part of politicians. Log rolling happens when two politicians agree to each support the provisions that are important to the other one, with the result that many bills that are important to individual legislators, but perhaps not important to broad social welfare, become law. Rather than just one legislator using government funds to build a new bridge or hospital, if 51% of the legislators come together, they can pass a bill which includes a pork barrel project for every one of their districts. Now, some research has suggested that support for the U.S. government's defense budget is encouraged by spreading out military bases and spending on weapons programs to congressional districts across the country. Another problem that is faced in monitoring politicians is that when multiple choices exist, majority vote can have a hard time choosing the best outcome, and the eventual choice might depend on the order in which the choices are presented. Consider this situation. There's a state where 60% of the population is liberal and 40% is conservative. So if there's two candidates, one liberal, one conservative, then the liberal's going to win. But what if it's a three-way race with two liberal candidates and only one conservative candidate? Maybe the liberal vote will split and victory will go to the minority party, in which case the outcome does not reflect the majority's preferences. think about the French national elections of 2002 for an interesting example. Before the election, the two leading candidates were expected to be Jacques Chirac and Lionel Jospin. But the French elections happen in two rounds. There's a preliminary round, which reduces the list of candidates to the top two, and then a runoff between those top two. In the preliminary round, the vote splintered. Chirac got 19% of the vote, and Jospin got 16%. However, a candidate named Jean-Marie Le Pen received 17% of the vote and snuck into second place, and the other 48% of the vote was split between 13 other candidates. Now, Jean-Marie Le Pen has been frequently criticized for extreme nationalist views that have sometimes crossed the line into intolerance and even racism. In the runoff, all the other candidates united behind Chirac, who beat Le Pen by 82% to 18%. Now, it's possible that Jospin would have beaten Chirac in the runoff, but the voting was so splintered in the preliminary round that he never got the chance. This is a general problem whenever support is splintered. Will the best two options make it to the final round? Or is there an option that was everybody's second best choice and no one's first best choice get eliminated too early? A final difficulty for government is that there's no exit for government. When a firm produces a product nobody wants to buy or produces at a higher cost than its competitors, the firm will suffer losses. And if it can't change its ways, the firm goes out of business. This might be hard for workers or local economies for that firm, but it also puts a lot of pressure on firms for good governance. But what if a government program isn't working? Who puts the government program out of business? What if a government agency provides bad service? Who competes it away? If you're upset, for example, that the Internal Revenue Service is slow in sending you a tax refund or isn't able to answer your questions, you can't say, well, I'll pay my income taxes through some different organization. There's no mechanism within government to allow exit and entry of better producers. Now, where does all this take us? What I've been sort of arguing is that there's a long list of reasons why what happens politically may not reflect the will of the majority and may not reflect the broader self-interest. I don't want to take this overboard. I don't want to say that this means we should get rid of democracy. A classic line from the British statesman Sir Winston Churchill is that no one pretends democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all of the other forms which have been tried from time to time. And in that spirit, the theme of my discussion is certainly not that democratic government should be abandoned. But my point is that a practical student of public policy needs to realize that democratic government is not ruled by all-wise economists. Hot breaking news here. Government is political. It's a set of agents, with voters and citizens trying somehow to exercise direction and control, but not always succeeding. So when we talk about the problems of markets and the possibility of government action, you need to take into account the problem of political governance. You need to realize that even well-intended government actions could make problems worse rather than better. We're drawing to the end of our microeconomics lectures here, and I want to try and pull together a few big things. Economic wisdom really requires understanding several seemingly contradictory things at the same time. The American author F. Scott Fitzgerald once wrote, the true test of a first-rate mind is the ability to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. Well, at this point in your study of microeconomics, I want you to go one better than Fitzgerald, and I want you to hold three somewhat contradictory ideas about the characteristics of markets in your mind all at the same time. First idea, markets are extraordinarily useful institutions through which society can allocate its scarce resources. They provide incentives for efficient production, for innovation, for the wise use of resources, for providing products that consumers want, and for increasing the standard of living over time. Markets are extraordinarily powerful and useful. Second idea, markets may sometimes produce unwanted results. Unwanted results that we've talked about in these lectures include monopoly, issues of imperfect competition, negative externalities like pollution, positive externalities in public goods like research and development issues, problems with poverty, inequality of income, discrimination, failures to provide insurance, and all sorts of problems of runaway top executives. So markets are not in any way perfect. The third idea, then, is that government can sometimes act to reduce the problems of markets, and government failure can also sometimes make matters worse. Governments can have a role to play, a useful role to play in addressing the problems of markets, but government action is also imperfect. The challenge here is to stay pragmatic. Be specific about the problem that the market is having. Be specific about the solution. Be realistic about what government is actually doing. Face the trade-offs and the risks openly. When you act like that, when you think like that, you're thinking like an economist.